Is China hacking into our corporations, universities, and law firms? I'm David Goertz. Joining me is Professor Darren Hayes of Pace University. He says we're already involved in a cyber war with China. Hey there, Darren. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing great. Well, I want to thank you for coming on here and talking to me. We've been talking on and off about this China thing. And as you know, I've been very concerned about the Chinese situation as well. I consider China a frenemy. And I've gone on record at the National Defense University as saying China may be one of America's greatest strategic problems in the coming century. Now, you came to my attention when you reported a network penetration at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that you attribute to China. Can you tell us about that?
We weren't given a whole lot of details, but basically a top lobbying group at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, their network was hacked and a large amount of data was taken and stolen. And they attribute this to the Chinese hacker group.
Okay. Now, they told you about this? Were you involved in researching it, or how did you get involved in all this?
It actually came to light in a number of different press releases, and that's how I came to know about this. So no insider information on this.
I see. So where does this fit in with your studies? Why don't you give us a background on you and what you're working on and how you relate to this kind of security issue?
Sure. I've been teaching here at Pace University for about 10 years and focusing on computer forensics for about the last 6 years. The focus of my research has kind of taken me in a number of different avenues, but been really intrigued about the kinds of threats that we've been seeing coming from China, and in particular, advanced persistent threats. Is becoming the new key term that's been tossed around and something that we all need to be well aware of.
You want to tell us about advanced persistent threats then?
Sure. Advanced persistent threats, you know, when we think about these, we often think about national government-sponsored, tech-savvy people making attacks on the US to steal intellectual property. So they're not your regular hackers trying to play games or to simply steal money. They're trying to steal assets in the form of intellectual property. They're advanced because our traditional security systems aren't able to identify or isolate where these attacks come from until it's too late. So to give you an example, we rely on firewalls, we rely on our antivirus and traditional security measures, intrusion detection systems. But the people that are attacking us are a lot more sophisticated. And the first thing that they'll actually do is that they'll change the security settings within a network. So for example, they'll put their IP addresses on the whitelist for a particular company, the firewall whitelist. And they're very advanced because very often it may be something as small as changing a couple of lines in a help file on Windows. So it's not something that your traditional antivirus or traditional security measures will be able to pick up. And unfortunately, a lot of companies will actually get a call from the FBI, or somebody will walk in and say, we believe that these documents belong to you. And sometimes this happens maybe 3 to 5 years after a network has been breached.
Now, you talked about things like modifying a help file. How would modifying a help file have an impact on security, for example?
Sure. Well, if you are able to insert malware code into a help file, your traditional security is not going to be able to pick that up as malware. It's just going to see a help file that it expects to see in your system, and so it doesn't raise any flags.
And what do they do with it? I mean, a help file is basically text. I mean, are you talking about somehow it's creating an executable payload or something like that that can then be triggered in some way?
That's exactly right. So the idea is to create a file that looks like a file that should be there. So to give you an example, very often we see these advanced persistent threats changing different types of service files. So DLL files, for example. And sometimes the only way of being able to identify these DLL files that should not be there is by matching the version type of that DLL file to the version of the operating system that's being run. Again, that's something that traditional intrusion detection and software wouldn't necessarily pick up.
Now, you say that this is persistent and it's going on for a while. Now, I know that Trend Micro recently, now Trend Micro is a Japanese-based anti-malware firm, they recently reported that they found malware in, I think it was India, Japan, the United States, and American defense firms, where they basically remotely sent in command and control systems into these firms through a PDF exploit. And what happened was, essentially the PDF exploit, the PDF was opened, it installed an exploit into Flash, and then they essentially had backdoor access, command and control remote access into the network of these defense departments, not defense department, defense companies, where they were then able to remotely travel throughout the network and continue to have this happen. And that lived for about 4 months before anybody discovered it.
Sure, you know, one of the problems is that you know, most of us, if we're using XP or higher, we have our Windows operating system updated automatically, and so these advanced hackers know that, but they know that we're more likely to click not to install updates for Adobe, for example. And so Adobe is one of the big threats for a lot of organizations, people not updating that, and people know the vulnerabilities that are there. When you're talking about different types of hosts that are infected in companies and people not realizing that for quite a long time, sometimes even when you find a host that has been infected, these advanced persistent threats, they'll move from machine to machine throughout the organization, and they may never get rid of the attacks that keep coming. In terms of persistent, I heard one account where somebody mentioned to me that Homeland Security suffers 2 million attacks a day on their different networks. And so, you know, we're talking about attacks on a very, very large scale.
So you also came to my attention because you made the claim that we're already involved in a cyber war with China. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. I think that basically when we take a look at the size of these attacks and where they're coming from, I really think that we're involved in a cyber war with China. And you know, there's no question in my mind that these are government-sponsored attacks. When we look, you know, even just a couple of days ago when we saw what happened with NASA and their jet propulsion lab that's been infiltrated. The end of last year, we heard about another couple of satellites. And so these are very, very large programs that the Chinese have infiltrated and been taken out, you know, from what I understand, terabytes and terabytes of data from the Department of Defense.
So you say there's no question in your mind that we're involved in a cyber war with China. Why is there no question in your mind? What's the corroboration of that?
The corroboration is people that I've spoken to who work on computer security for the government. So I don't directly get data on this and how much this occurs, but people that I know who work with the Department of Defense have talked about these attacks and how, because they're so advanced and because the number of people involved in these attacks, that it must be government sponsored.
So it's pretty easy to attribute this sort of thing to an IP address in a particular country, but you say it's backed by the Chinese government. How can you differentiate that between, you know, Chinese hackers? There's what, 1.3 billion people in China. Not all of the nefarious activities are going to necessarily come through government-sponsored activities. So how can you say that this is a government activity versus, whether it's Chinese organized crime or any other activity like that?
Sure. Well, I think that if we look at the motivation and what they're targeting, we can kind of, decide where it's coming from. So, for example, in Russia, we've many of us have heard about the Russian business network who are involved with dealing in stolen credit card numbers, and the motivation there is to steal money, and that's really anybody who's serious about hacking and is willing to put their safety on the line is looking to steal money very often. When we look at what's happening with attacks from China, the goal is to collect intellectual property. So information is the asset that they're looking for.
Okay. And when you say information, are we talking about strictly defense-related information, or are we talking about other kinds of information like, the formula behind Mrs. Fields cookies?
I think we're looking at all different types of information. Sometimes, actually, when there are attacks on companies, corporations are often reluctant to get law enforcement involved, and so very often attacks from China we don't hear about as much from companies because they simply don't want the bad publicity. In terms of attacks on government installations, yes, we're hearing about Department of Defense agencies being attacked, so they're looking to get information relating to defense. But we're also looking at a lot of attacks that are targeting NASA, satellite systems, and the space program in general.
Why don't you tell me more about that?
Well, at the end of last year, we heard about a couple of U.S. satellites being infiltrated by the Chinese, and this actually predates a few years before that. So, as I say, some of these attacks they only discover years later. In terms of NASA as well, we also heard about their Jet Propulsion Lab and that network being broken into. We heard about that over the weekend.
Okay. Well, let's move on. You told me that law firms and universities are big targets for Chinese penetration and exfiltration. Let's talk universities first.
Well, very often universities do a lot of research with Department of Defense. They win Department of Defense grants, but unfortunately, very often their security isn't as tight as what is expected from a defense contractor. And so that's a big problem. So they're big storage areas for intellectual property. And one of the problems with exfiltration is that so many universities today collaborate with China, do a lot of business with China, have even set up and have a presence in China. So it's difficult for a university and their network administrators to block access to Chinese IP addresses. So it's very, very difficult. If you're an organization and you know that you should not be dealing with China, you can automatically say this range of IP addresses we should not be communicating with. Very different story when it comes to universities, especially today as universities are looking to expand and their influence in Asia, and particularly China.
That's a really interesting point. One of my concerns about the university system has always been that foreign nationals are working in the universities, usually in graduate programs, and they often have access to some very sophisticated research, often on contract to government agencies. And yet they're foreign nationals, and they're going to go home and take that knowledge or report that knowledge back to their countries of origin. Have you seen that? Is that a concern that you've got?
It's a concern that I've heard from government officials and it's very difficult today because we know that consumer spending with Chinese is very, very good right now, and we welcome the students into our universities. But the problem is that tiny percentage, some government agents are worried about students coming here. So they're also worried about our faculty going and teaching in exchange programs, or our students studying over there, particularly connecting with wireless networks while they're over there in China. And there is a big, big concern right there today.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question that pretty much anything that you're passing through the border going into China, you want to essentially never use again. Probably is a good way to look at it. So let's take a look at law firms now. You had said that there is that law firms are particularly juicy targets, and particularly to the Chinese. Why is that?
Well, law firms are not known for their security. When we think about traditionally, networks are built for business. They're not built for security. And that's particularly the case with law firms. Now, law firms are involved with a lot of different cases that involve intellectual property. So especially in e-discovery cases, for example, and civil litigation, where there has to be disclosure of vast quantities of information and access to information both on the plaintiff and the defendant side. So they are not known for security, and so they become prime targets for hackers from China.
And what do the Chinese do with this information?
Good question, but when you think about the types of litigation involving whether it's pharmaceutical companies or it's industrial conglomerates, the type of information when just looking at the type of litigation that's going on, you can imagine the amount and the wealth of information that's available to people who are willing to hack into those networks.
So Darren, what is your background? How are you involved in this cyber research? Are you hands-on, or is this just papers you've read? Where do you fit into this?
Where I fit into this is that my focus is on computer forensics. And I believe that there should be a big push to get more people involved in computer forensics because it's a very different discipline. Security is being proactive, it's about protecting systems, but unfortunately there's simply not enough people out there who are able to investigate what has happened. So even in terms of computer forensics, there's very few people who understand the network and understand how to identify intrusions into a network. And so that's my focus, is to try and get more people who understand server technology, who understand networks, who are able to understand what these advanced persistent threats are. And unfortunately, our education system is not teaching the right things necessarily. There's very few programs out there, for example, that will talk about reverse engineering malware and being able to discover where exactly particular malware comes from, how to find out what IP address of what server it's trying to communicate with. And these are really the skills that are needed by the Department of Homeland Security. So, how many people out there can really talk about monitoring TCP traffic and being able to identify aberrations in that traffic? It's a science, and unfortunately, we're not getting enough people involved in this. In general terms, we're not getting enough people into the IT sector, and really there's tremendous amount of jobs, but there's also a tremendous amount of jobs with the government, and the government are coming knocking on our door and the other doors of universities, trying to get people who have expertise in IT. There's just simply not enough people involved in this area.
Well, since I've got you here, I'm gonna actually give you an on-site homework assignment then. I have a letter to the editor from a currently active serving serviceman who I don't know whether he's an officer, I don't know whether he's an enlisted person, I don't know if he's got college experience, but basically he asked me he'd like to get involved in cybersecurity. What does he do? What's the career path? Why don't you tell me what you think you would advise him, both in terms of going through the traditional university program and what he might take advantage of if he's already in the hierarchy of the Department of Defense?
Sure. Well, again, my bias is towards computer forensics and the investigative part. So I'm looking at systems after a crime has been committed. I think that the bedrock for my field of study is file systems. And so once you understand file systems and their related operating systems, then you have a better understanding of how information is being captured. So it's a much bigger landscape than, say, looking at your file explorer on a computer. So we're talking about changes to configuration files in Windows File Registry, for example. And not a lot of people have that kind of understanding, and that's really important. So I'd say operating systems, file systems provide a great bedrock for this field of study. After that, knowledge of hardware is also important, and knowing the setup of networks, knowing how networks work, knowing about switches, that's also important. One of the biggest growing areas right now that I see is in the field of mobile forensics and mobile security. So, for example, I've been asked by law enforcement if we could perhaps look at a project where we can look at Android phones and see people who've traveled abroad. How would we be able to identify if malware had been installed on that particular device, and where did it come from? So I mention Android because Android is one of those marketplaces where applications are simply not being screened enough, and so we're hearing more and more about the mobile world being the biggest vulnerability. So that's a big problem. So mobile security, mobile forensics, definitely important. Networks, network security, file systems, operating systems, I think that these are all really important if you're interested in this field of study.
Now, is that something where he would take specific classes? Are there certifications he should do? Or do you know if there's opportunities in the Defense Department for him, or is it mostly through the university system, these areas that he should be looking at?
I think that I think a balance of both is really important. So I believe that going to a university and getting a degree is important and provides you with important information relating to these particular subjects that I talked about. But I think it's a balance, because I think that if you're interested and want to be taken seriously by an employer, that you should also be certified in using some of these tools. So, for example, if you're interested in Mac forensics, being able to be certified with black bag technologies. Access Data have a number of FTK boot camps. They also have their mobile phone examiner certification. So those types of certifications are also important. But then there's also more specific professional certifications with organizations like SANS, for example, which will be very, very specific on a topic. So they'll look at ethical hacking maybe, or wireless routers, and you'll have people who will teach you in that class, people from the Department of Justice, for example, people who work for maybe Booz Allen Hamilton, and so you also want to go the certification route as well.
So, a top government official at one of the sort of unnamed three-letter agencies once told me that the Chinese have more honor students than we have students. So, scope out to me the full Chinese threat related to things like our financial obligations. Where do you see China, geopolitically as it pertains to the United States, when on one hand we have economic obligations to them, we have a status where we're attempting to be allies with them, and at the same time they keep doing these sort of probing attacks that you think and others think are directly attributable to government sources. What's the whole Chinese picture?
It really puts the U.S. in a precarious position, because at the one time you want to woo investment, but at the same time you want to protect our security. And at the same time, there's the addition of the fact that we're also probing the Chinese for information that they might have. And so, we're also looking at foreign governments and trying to get information about their defense strategy. So there's that other element as well. I think that it is very difficult, and I think that the Obama administration has been quite clear about some of these threats, and I think that they haven't been afraid to talk to the Chinese about broaching the subject. But as long as business is so big, as long as investment is so great, it means that we're still not going to be able to combat the threat to the full extent that we want to. And if it's going to be government-sponsored threats that we're talking about, it makes it even more difficult, because it's not like we can work with Interpol and work with local law enforcement to stamp out these threats.
So, are you essentially saying we're doomed?
Doomed is a very strong word, but for example, only the other day, last week, about 20 anonymous hackers were arrested. And the arrest came in the wake of an Interpol investigation, working with local law enforcement on the ground in Colombia, Chile, and other South American countries. We simply don't have that luxury when it comes to China. And so that's where the issue is.
Gotcha. Well, let's take your forensic background for a second here and look at something that I'm continually concerned about, and I'm not quite sure how to take it. Now, obviously, the file system and the operating environment for Android systems are substantially different from those on the iPhone. And I did a lecture on that recently where, we looked at how there's secondary app stores and people can upload fake apps to the secondary app stores, and then people are downloading those things and they have payloads on them. But here's my question. Phones, tablets, motherboards, computers, laptops, they're all built in China. They're all built at places like Foxconn or Huawei or whatever. Are we at risk because we buy all our gear from stuff made by a country that is essentially trying to hack us? Are there payloads in every one of those things that we bring home?
Well, I think the fact that some government agencies have made clear that they are not going to buy products like Lenovo computers, manufactured in China, I think that it's pretty clear that they believe that there's a threat. So, there's certain parts of the computer that you're never fully going to be able to access. When you think about a ROM chip and what can be stored in there, there are agencies who are shying away from buying anything that's being manufactured in China. And so I think that raises a concern for all of us.
So why specifically Lenovo?
Well, Lenovo was purchased from IBM by a Chinese company, so that's why the concern is there, and I think it's a concern with all products that are now going to be produced by China.
Well, since, for example, I guess like 70 or 80% of the motherboards that we get are made by, say, Asus, should we be, which is also a Chinese firm, should we be concerned about every computer that's made by even American companies because we're using major Chinese components?
I think it all depends on the part that's going to be used. So if it's a Yamaha sound card, for example, we probably don't have to be worried about that. I think it's just primarily areas of the computer where information is stored that we don't have direct access to. And so, those are the kinds of components. But, in some situations, you're going to have some kind of integrated part that comes from China.
So should we be more concerned about our iPhones and our Android phones? I mean, should we make sure that there's nothing confidential on our phones because all that might be sent to China behind the scenes?
That's a good question, and I think I'm actually maybe a little bit more concerned about what Google is collecting on us and where that information ends up than on what the Chinese government is seeing.
Yeah, Google knows that I have a fixation on muscle cars. I mean, it's really, but I don't have an interesting life, so
Sure.
The fact that they want to show me pictures of muscle cars, all right, fine. There's just so many muscle cars that any one person can ogle. So there we go.
Sure.
So talk to me a little bit more about forensics in terms of projects you've been on and anything really interesting or disturbing you've discovered hands-on.
Really, I think that I think that when I get into the field of forensics, I think that the amount of information that's out there about us and the type of information that people are capturing about us is pretty astounding. I think that we often think of doing a Google search and that brings up everything, but there's so many other ways online that people can find information about you and build up a profile about you. So whether it's using Foursquare to identify and track where you're going, to geolocational data that's captured with photographs, being able to identify where you're going, to people using Facebook to reset your email password and gain access to your emails. It's pretty startling what people can do. Services like Bluff My Call, which can you can basically change your caller ID to anything you want, gains you access to somebody's voicemail on their cell phone if it's not password protected, for example. I think that there's so many vulnerabilities out there that people don't realize, and so one of the things I do with a lot of my students is go through this exercise of showing them how an investigator works and how a hacker works, and they often work in the same kind of way with culling information online, and making my students aware of how many different pieces of information we can find out about them and how I can easily build up a profile on who they are and where they're going at any one time. So I think that that's one of the starting, parts of the work that I do.
That's really interesting. Well, Darren, I want to thank you for the time that you've spent with us today. I think we've learned quite a bit that's really interesting. Is there anything you'd like to tell people before we wrap this thing up?
Yes, I think that, we need more people in the industry. I think that we often don't realize how big a problem, hacking is, whether it's from the Chinese or whether it's domestically. There's one particular statistic I'd just like to put out there that I saw in a recent report, that annual losses resulting from cybercrime are valued at 388 billion. And by contrast, illicit sales with marijuana, heroin, and cocaine industry are estimated to be 288 billion industry. So we often think of drugs as being an epidemic, but unfortunately we don't think about security and information stealing as being an epidemic.
What was the source of that study?
I think that this was, let me just see here. I have to look up. I think it was a semantic study.
Okay.
Semantic report.
Cool. Well, if we get that information, we'll stick it in the show notes for people to be able to see when they view this later on. I want to thank Professor Darren Hayes of Pace University for his time. Everybody, thank you, Darren, for coming by.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
And that was Professor Darren Hayes of Pace University. You got a lot of information out of this, including some interesting stuff about forensics, some career options, some concerns about how information is shared on your machines. Be careful what you put on your machines. Be careful how you share that information. And also keep an eye on our relations between these different countries. We have a situation here that's very interesting. We have to work with major countries like China, who in fact we owe a tremendous amount of money to, but at the same time they are also essentially probing us and potentially putting us at risk as well. So it's a very, very fine line to walk with this kind of relationship. And this is an area I've worked with quite a bit and will continue to study and talk about on ZDNet Government. Once again, thanks to Professor Darren Hayes of Pace University, and thank you all for listening and watching.